A thin veil of dust clung to the crumbling edges of Winthorpe Manor when Inspector Helena Crestwood arrived, her coat still damp from the fog that swallowed the estate. The call had come scarcely an hour earlier, an urgent, breathless request from the caretaker who claimed something unspeakable had happened in the Manor's abandoned East Wing. The old place had been empty for years, save for the caretaker's weekly rounds, yet tonight it seemed to pulse with a strange, taut silence. Inside, the caretaker led her to a locked study whose heavy oak door bore deep scratches along the frame, as if someone had clawed their way in or out. The key was still in the caretaker's trembling hand. According to him, the room had been sealed for decades. No one had entered since the death of Lord Harrington, its former owner, whose eccentricities were still whispered about by the villagers. When the lock clicked open and the door creaked inward, Helena found the room in eerie disarray. Dust lay thick on the shelves, but the armchair had been dragged to the center of the room, its legs cutting fresh grooves across the floor. Papers yellowed with age were scattered around it in a rough circle, and at the center sat a single object that did not belong, a new, gleaming silver locket. Its surface was immaculate, untouched by dust or time. No body, no sign of forced entry, except the scratches, no intruder footprints. Just that locket and an overturned ink bottle whose spill formed an oddly deliberate shape on the wooden planks, a curved line intersected by two short strokes, almost like a distorted letter or symbol. "Who else has a key to this room?" Helena asked quietly. "No one," the caretaker whispered, "not a soul. The oddity of it, an apparently sealed room, a newly placed object, clues that pointed everywhere and nowhere, felt too deliberate, as though the crime were a puzzle laid out for her benefit. But there was no victim, no thief, no sign of struggle, only mystery arranged with theatrical precision. Helena stepped closer to the locket, careful not to disturb the ink pattern. When she opened the delicate clasp, her breath caught. Inside was a miniature portrait, a young woman with sharp eyes and a faint, knowing smile. Beneath the portrait was a name engraved so lightly it was almost invisible. Ilara Harrington. Lord Harrington's daughter, missing for 20 years. But the room held one more curiosity. Near the window, where the moonlight struggled through grime-coated glass, Helena noticed a single fresh footprint on the dusty floorboards. Small, delicate, certainly not the caretaker's. It pointed toward the wall, not the window, and when Helena pressed her palm against the panel, it seemed to thrum faintly, as though hollow behind the surface. The crime was either impossibly simple, a planted trinket in a forgotten room, or infinitely complex, a secret buried in layers of misdirection. Yet one thing was unmistakable. Someone had been here very recently, someone who knew the manor's forgotten paths, someone who wanted the past to resurface. And as Helena traced the odd ink symbol again with her eyes, she felt it, a tug toward something deeper, something twisted in the old manor's bones. The investigation had not even begun, but the first thread of the mystery had already pulled tight around her. Helena let her fingers rest against the hollow panel a moment longer, listening to the muted echo behind it, but she stepped back as the caretaker's lantern wavered uncertainly. The local constables had arrived and were already shuffling about the corridor, murmuring routine questions, marking down statements, and treating the locked room as though it were merely another abandoned chamber in an old house. Their presence felt clumsy, like heavy boots on thin ice. While they measured footprints and dusted irrelevant surfaces, Helena's eyes drifted to something near the threshold, a faint smear of ink no larger than a fingernail, brushed across the doorframe at shoulder height. It matched the spilled ink inside the room, but it was too far from the puddle to be accidental. Someone had touched the ink deliberately and carried it out with them. The constables hadn't noticed. They were too busy checking whether the caretaker had misplaced his key. "Inspector, nothing suggests an intruder," one of them declared confidently. "Old rooms settle strangely. Perhaps animals got in." Helena only glanced at him before kneeling beside the armchair, studying its legs. The grooves carved into the dusty floorboards were straight, too straight. Someone had dragged it with care, not in panic or haste, and beneath the chair, half hidden where only someone expecting odd angles would look, she saw a small brass button, clean, recently polished, not dusty like the rest of the room. "Does this belong to you?" she asked the caretaker. He shook his head violently. "No, Mum. I haven't worn anything with buttons like that in years." Yet Helena had seen that style recently. Or rather, she'd seen the absence of it. Just minutes earlier, when the constables filed in, one of them, Sergeant Lorne, had been missing the top button on his coat. She remembered it because he'd tugged the collar awkwardly, as if trying to hide the fact. Helena tucked the button into her pocket without comment. Her gaze shifted to Lorne, who stood near the fireplace, tapping his notebook with a stiffness that didn't match his easy manner from earlier. He avoided the locket completely, never once looking at it despite the other's fascination. And when the caretaker nervously mentioned Lord Harrington's missing daughter, Lorne's jaw twitched ever so slightly. An involuntary reaction, gone in an instant. "Sergeant," Helena said casually, "you were first among your team to arrive, weren't you?" "Yes, Inspector. Came straight in to secure the area." "Straight in," she echoed softly, looking again at the small, fresh footprint by the window, the one no officer had claimed, the one too small to belong to any of the men present. Lorne met her eyes for a fraction of a second, and in that fraction something tightened. Fear, recognition, or guilt. She couldn't yet tell. But the room was beginning to speak, piece by piece, and the voice it carried hinted that someone here knew more than they dared admit. The first threads of deception were no longer whispers. They were there in the ink, the button, the twitch of an eye. And though the full shape of the truth remained hidden behind that hollow panel, Helena felt the investigation beginning to shift, quietly, inevitably, towards someone who had hoped to remain unnoticed. Helena motioned for the constables to gather everyone in the main hall, the flickering lanterns casting long shadows across the worn tapestries. The caretaker, still pale and trembling, perched on the edge of a wooden bench, his hands clasped so tightly that the knuckles were white. Sergeant Lorne remained standing, stiff as a guard post, while the other officers hovered uneasily near the door. Helena began methodically, starting with the caretaker. "Tell me again exactly what you saw tonight," she said, her tone neutral but sharp. "From the moment you arrived at the East Wing until you called us," the caretaker's voice quavered. I came to check the East Wing as usual. Everything was as it always is, quiet, empty. Then I saw the door ajar. I never touched that room, I swear, I never—" His words faltered, his eyes flicking toward Lorne as though he feared an accusation would leap from him. Helena noted the slight hesitation but let it pass, moving next to Lorne. "And you, Sergeant, you were first on the scene?" "Yes," he said smoothly, almost too smoothly. "I secured the perimeter, confirmed the caretaker's story, and waited for the inspector." His gaze flickered briefly toward the locket, but shifted away the moment Helena's eyes met his. She asked him to recount his actions inside the room. Lorne's story was precise, almost rehearsed, but a small detail caught her attention. He claimed to have inspected the floor thoroughly, yet he made no mention of the fresh footprint near the window, which Helena had already noticed. "Did anyone else enter the East Wing before your arrival?" she pressed. Lorne's eyes narrowed subtly. "No, only the caretaker." Helena scribbled notes, but her mind raced. There were too many contradictions, too many tiny gaps. The caretaker insisted he hadn't touched the locket, yet he had been closest to it. Lorne omitted details he should have seen, and the other officers each offered slightly differing timelines of when they reached the manor, minor shifts that didn't quite align but weren't immediately obvious. Then Helena turned her attention to a quiet, elderly woman who had come with the caretaker, a distant relative of the Harringtons. "Did you notice anything unusual when you arrived?" "Oh, I don't rightly know," the woman replied, wringing her handkerchief. "I only noticed that the East Wing seemed colder than usual, and that shadow by the fireplace looked wrong somehow. But I thought it was just my imagination, too eager to defer to reason," Helena thought. The woman's hesitation was natural, but the precision with which she remembered the shadows struck her as rehearsed. Perhaps she was testing her own memory, or hiding it. Each account, when placed side by side, created a web of tiny inconsistencies, footsteps that didn't match, objects noticed or ignored, depending on who was speaking, glances exchanged that hinted at unspoken recognition. Helena could feel the tension in the room thickening, the truth lurking beneath polite speech and nervous gestures. She leaned back slightly, letting silence settle over the group. Everyone was watching, wondering if she'd speak, and in that moment she sensed it. The careful performances were beginning to crack. The locket, the ink, the footprint, the polished button, all of it pointed towards someone here manipulating events. Someone had deliberately choreographed what appeared to be random, and beneath the surface, motives remained tightly buried, waiting for her to unearth them. Helena's instincts sharpened. One of them was lying, not out of fear, but for a reason far more deliberate, and she was determined to uncover who and why. Helena stepped back from the group, letting their nervous energy settle into the quiet murmur of the Old Manor. She knew that each person in the hall had a motive, though none were immediately obvious, and none explained the precision of the scene in the East Wing. Greed whispered from the caretaker's hands. He had access to the manor's hidden valuables, and the Harrington estate had been the subject of speculation in the village for decades. Lorne carried the weight of ambition, a promotion delayed, a reputation to protect. The elderly relative radiated a quiet envy, the kind that simmered over long years, watching her family's secrets fade from the public eye. And fear of discovery, of scandal, or perhaps of something far older, hung about the shadows like the fog outside. Helena began to sort through the alibis, noting contradictions that at first seemed trivial. The caretaker claimed he had not touched the locket, yet he had handled the key moments leading up to its discovery. Lorne insisted he had examined every inch of the floor, but Helena knew that fresh footprint had gone unmentioned, and the elderly woman, though she offered only vague observations, seemed keenly aware of the manor's hidden spaces, more so than a casual visitor would be. She moved silently to the fireplace and traced the edges of the mantelpiece, her fingers brushing along faint scratches invisible to anyone not looking closely. Her eyes narrowed on a hairpin lodged in the dust, fine, dark, and delicate. It was far too refined to belong to the caretaker or the officers, yet it was identical in style to a pin the elderly woman had been wearing. Helena pocketed it without comment, letting the group chatter among themselves, unaware that she was gathering the threads that would later weave the full story. The silver locket weighed heavy in her thoughts, a portrait of Elara Harrington, missing for 2 decades, now placed deliberately in a room long thought sealed. Who could have arranged such a scene? Helena considered the possibilities. Someone wanting to force the past into the present, someone testing the loyalty or the ignorance of the caretaker, someone hiding a personal connection to Elara herself. Every person here had a reason to involve themselves in the mystery, family loyalty twisted into resentment, ambition mingled with fear of being found out, the quiet greed the company's old estates left unattended. She called each suspect forward one by one, questioning them about Elara Harrington's disappearance. Each answer layered the web of deception further. The caretaker's explanation wavered under gentle pressure. Lorne's precision bordered on theatrical. The elderly woman's recollections slipped from vague to pointed when asked about secret passages in the manor. And each small slip, each hesitation fed Helena's growing certainty that nothing here was coincidental. The locket, the footprint, the ink, the brass button. They were all pieces of a design only the perpetrator fully understood. Helena's mind raced, arranging connections like a map. The caretaker had opportunity, Lorne had motive, and the elderly woman possessed knowledge. But no single thread tied all the events together. She realized that to solve the mystery, she would need to uncover not just who acted, but why, and how they managed to manipulate the manor's history and the people within it. Each lie, each concealed reaction, was a piece of the puzzle, and Helena felt the shape of the truth beginning to emerge, a twisted secret that had slept in the manor for decades, only to be wrenched into the open tonight. Helena returned to the East Wing, retracing her steps through the room with a slower, more deliberate pace. The locket still lay in the center of the armchair, its portrait catching the pale light from the high window. but her attention was drawn to the ink pattern on the floor, the strange symbol that had first hinted at a hidden hand. She knelt and examined it closely, her fingers careful not to disturb the shape. There, pressed lightly into the still moist ink, were tiny impressions that looked like the marks of a ring. Delicate, twisted, almost ornamental. Whoever had left it had done so deliberately, as if leaving a signature without intending it to be obvious. She compared it with the brass button she had collected earlier, and the hairpin tucked in her pocket. A possibility emerged. The object placement was personal. Not random, not a simple attempt to mislead, but a deliberate message, a breadcrumb meant for someone who could read it. Helena felt the familiar spark of insight, the first breakthrough since she had arrived, but she also felt the prickling doubt at the edge of it. She called the constables over, pointing to the locket and the ink impressions. "This is the key," she said quietly. "Somebody here is connected to Alara Harrington more directly than we thought. Examine everything. Doors, drawers, clothing. Nothing can be overlooked." By nightfall, the authorities had rushed to pin the crime on the caretaker, citing the strange button and his proximity to the scene. They were satisfied that a motive of curiosity mixed with opportunity explained the placement of the locket. Officers congratulated themselves, and Lorne even allowed a small, relieved smile, as though the case had been neatly tied up. Helena, however, could not share their relief. The room felt too arranged, too deliberate, too theatrical. The caretaker's hands shook, yes, but only with fear, not guilt. The locket's placement, the ink symbol, the footprints, they spoke of planning, of knowledge, of control. The solution they celebrated ignored the subtler threads woven throughout the manor. The real culprit was not trembling in fear, but watching, waiting, and calculating the next move. As she examined the hollow panel behind the fireplace once more, Helena noticed a tiny scuff mark near the base, just large enough for a hand to slip through. It was a detail the others had missed entirely, and it told her that someone had entered and exited in a way that defied the obvious routes. The signs were subtle, almost invisible, but they were there for anyone who knew how to see. Helena's pulse quickened. The breakthrough everyone hailed as the end of the mystery was only the beginning. Somewhere in Winthorpe Manor, the true criminal moved silently through the shadows, confident that the authorities were blind and that their secret would remain hidden until the perfect moment. And Helena knew with chilling clarity that when that moment came, the consequences would be far more dangerous than a simple misplaced locket or a hasty accusation. Helena stayed in the east wing long after the others had left, letting the fog outside thicken against the tall windows. Her eyes roamed over the dusty shelves, the forgotten ledgers, and the faint scratches along the oak floorboards, until one detail caught her attention, a small folded piece of parchment wedged behind a loose panel in the wall. It was yellowed, brittle, and clearly very old, but the handwriting was unmistakable, ornate, deliberate, with the flourish of a practiced hand. She unfolded it carefully and discovered a series of notes from nearly 30 years ago. The writing detailed a dispute over Winthorpe Manor's inheritance, chronicling secret meetings, accusations of betrayal, and even the disappearance of Alara Harrington's governess. One line jumped out: "The key to her absence lies not in her leaving, but in the loyalty of those who should protect her." Helena's pulse quickened. The case was no longer just about a newly discovered locket or a mysterious footprint. It was entwined with decades of secrets and silent betrayals. Returning to the hall, she examined the suspects with renewed focus. Patterns she had overlooked began to emerge. The caretaker's family had served the Harringtons for generations, bound by loyalty and old grudges. Lorne's father had been a lawyer involved in the original inheritance dispute, and the elderly relative had been the governess's closest confidant, or so she claimed. The connections weren't obvious at first glance, but now they formed a hidden lattice. Bloodlines, old debts, and long-buried resentments intersected in ways that explained knowledge and access previously deemed impossible. Helena cross-referenced the old parchment with the subtle clues she had already gathered: the ink impressions, the brass button, the hairpin, even the peculiar scratches on the doorframe. Suddenly, the footprints, the carefully placed locket, and the hollow panel all aligned with a single, invisible strategy, a plan that had roots in the past and had been executed with patience across decades. It became clear that the crime wasn't merely opportunistic. It was personal, crafted to unearth old grievances and force the present generation to confront mistakes they had inherited without realizing. Every suspect had a tie to that hidden history, whether through family, loyalty, or knowledge of the manor's concealed pathways. And Helena understood that the real criminal wasn't acting in haste. They were following a carefully preserved script, one that had waited for the right moment to surface. The past and present had collided, leaving behind a trail that only someone who knew both could navigate. Helena realized that to uncover the truth, she would need to trace those old loyalties, decipher the hidden resentments, and expose the shadow manipulating events from behind the curtain of time. The manor had secrets, and now those secrets were beginning to speak loudly enough to guide her toward the heart of the mystery. Helena gathered the suspects once more in the manor's dimly lit drawing room, the heavy curtains drawn against the encroaching fog. This time, she decided to test them differently, not with direct questions, but with an experiment designed to reveal instinctive reactions. She placed the silver locket on the table, leaving it slightly open, and began to speak in tones that were casual yet suggestive, recounting the history of Alara Harrington's disappearance, the inheritance disputes, and the secrets of the East Wing. "What strikes me as curious," she said, letting her voice linger over the words, "is how easily the room surrendered its secrets, yet some details remain hidden. The locket itself seems almost protective, as though it knows who should see it and who should not." She let her gaze drift across the faces of those gathered. "I wonder who among us holds knowledge that hasn't yet been shared, either out of fear or pride." The caretaker shifted uneasily, fingers tightening around his coat. The elderly woman's hands fluttered against her lap, a faint tremor betraying her nerves. But it was Lorne who reacted most unexpectedly. His hand twitched toward the pocket of his coat, then froze. His eyes flicked toward the locket, then away, and a faint color left his cheeks. Helena noted the subtle changes, the almost imperceptible inhale, the micro-expression of tension along his jaw. "Sergeant," she said softly, leaning forward, "you've been remarkably precise in your accounts, almost rehearsed, yet certain details remain curiously absent. I wonder, how often does one omit information and still claim truthfulness?" Lorne's composure cracked for the briefest moment. He exhaled sharply, his gaze darting to the floor, and then he tried to laugh it off. I don't know what you mean, Inspector," he stammered. Helena smiled faintly, knowing she had touched the right nerve. The psychological pressure had forced him into instinct, bypassing the carefully curated mask of confidence. That subtle crack, invisible to everyone else, was the key she needed. Someone with intimate knowledge of the manor, the history of the Harrington family, and access to the East Wing at just the right time. The room seemed to hold its breath as Helena observed him. Lorne's reaction, though nearly imperceptible, had revealed what no direct questioning could: a connection, a hidden familiarity, and a latent guilt. The web was beginning to unravel, and Helena sensed that the next step would force the true criminal to act, to reveal themselves fully, or risk leaving the final piece of the puzzle exposed to her insight. Helena returned to the East Wing the following morning, determined to document every detail before the day's inquiries could scatter them. The locket, the ink impressions, the brass button. Each piece had been carefully catalogued the night before, but as she approached the armchair, her stomach tightened. The locket was gone. Her eyes scanned the floor and shelves. Nothing. No sign of forced entry, no footprints beyond the ones she had already noted. It was as if the object had evaporated into thin air. Helena's mind raced. Whoever had taken it had not only access but knowledge of her methods, of her attention to detail. The theft was not random. It was a calculated attempt to bury the key to the investigation before it could lead to the truth. She called the caretaker and the remaining officers immediately. The caretaker swore he hadn't moved it. The other constables seemed genuinely baffled. Yet Helena's instincts told her someone present was manipulating the scene, ensuring that the investigation faltered at the moment it gained momentum. Her gaze fell on Lorne. He stood just beyond the doorway, fingers nervously brushing the edge of the mantelpiece. Helena noted how he avoided the caretaker's eyes, how his posture, usually rigid, was now tense with subtle unease. She didn't yet accuse him, but she understood. The person who removed the locket knew precisely how valuable it was and how crucial it had become to exposing hidden connections. The stakes had shifted. No longer was Helena merely uncovering the manor's secrets. She was being actively obstructed. Trust became fragile. Every glance, every hesitation from the suspects carried double meaning. Even the caretaker, loyal for decades, now seemed vulnerable to suspicion, if only because someone could be using him as a pawn. Helena traced the edges of the fireplace once more, her eyes catching a faint smudge in the dust where the locket had rested. The thief had left a trace, subtle and almost imperceptible, yet enough for a keen observer. Her pulse quickened. Whoever had taken it had been clever, but they had also left a breadcrumb. And Helena, sharper than any of them realized, would follow it. The game had intensified. The criminal was no longer content with subtlety or suggestion. They were willing to act, to remove the evidence that might reveal their identity. Helena knew that unless she moved carefully, the truth could vanish entirely. And yet, she welcomed the challenge. The theft only confirmed that she was closing in, that the real culprit was aware of her scrutiny, and that the final confrontation was approaching. Helena barely had time to process the missing locket before the manor erupted into chaos. A frantic scream echoed from the servants' quarters, piercing the foggy silence that had settled over the estate. She raced down the narrow corridor, lantern in hand, to find the young housemaid trembling against the wall. It's Mr. Lorne," she stammered. He's gone." Helena's heart tightened. Lorne, the very suspect she had begun to suspect, had vanished. The room he had occupied was empty, the window ajar, letting in the cold, damp night air, but no footprints led from it. It was as though he had melted into the shadows themselves. A small smear of blood on the windowsill was the only evidence of struggle, but it was minimal, almost staged. The officers rushed in, muttering about searches and patrols, but Helena held up a hand. She crouched beside the windowsill, her eyes tracing every mark. Whoever had taken Lorne had not acted in panic. They had planned it meticulously, leaving only a trace enough to taunt, to warn. The criminal was still several steps ahead, and the manor itself had become a trap filled with invisible corridors and hidden exits. Helena's mind raced. The theft of the locket had been a warning. Now the disappearance of Lorne was proof that the perpetrator was escalating. The web of deception she had been untangling was far from complete, and if she did not act quickly, the next step could be far deadlier. Every hidden passage, every obscure family connection, every old grudge now had to be reconsidered in the light of this new development. The house was tense, charged with fear, yet Helena felt a surge of clarity. The criminal was bold, clever, and calculating, someone who understood the manor's secrets intimately. But even the most careful plan had cracks, and Helena knew she would exploit them. She turned to the constables, her voice sharp, commanding focus. "Search every room, every hidden space. Don't assume anything is what it seems. Lorne is still alive, but only if we act fast." As she retraced Lorne's last known movements in her mind, Helena realized the investigation had transformed. This was no longer just about uncovering old secrets or stolen evidence. It was a race against time, a struggle to prevent another act of calculated violence. The criminal was not hiding in ignorance. They were playing the game intentionally, daring her to anticipate each move. Helena smiled grimly to herself. The challenge had been laid bare, and she intended to meet it head-on. Helena moved back into the east wing, the manor's shadows thick around her, and paused at the fireplace where she had first noticed the hollow panel. Her eyes swept over the room, restless and searching. Amid the chaos, the missing locket, Lorne's disappearance, the lingering fog of decades-old secrets, one detail nudged insistently at the edge of her mind. The caretaker's offhand remark from the previous night about the east wing always feeling colder. like it resents being entered. At first, she had dismissed it as nervous superstition, the rambling of a man unnerved by an empty, drafty manor. But now, with Lorne gone and the locket stolen, Helena realized that the caretaker's perception wasn't fear, it was observation. He had unconsciously noticed subtle drafts, the faint hum of a hidden corridor, a door long sealed yet not truly secure. She turned, examining the edges of the panel more closely. There, almost invisible in the gloom, were tiny scratches along the woodwork, too precise to be accidental, too deliberate to be ordinary decay. Her eyes shifted to the furniture, tracing the lines of the armchair, the scuff marks on the floor, and the smudged corners where dust had been disturbed. It clicked. The locket had never been truly hidden. Its placement, the ink impressions, even the brass button, all pointed to a single, deliberate route through the manor, one that only someone intimately familiar with every secret passage and hidden panel could navigate. The same route that Lorne must have tried to take, or that someone had used to intercept him. Then, Helena noticed the smallest clue, almost laughably trivial, a faint smear of ink on the caretaker's lantern handle, identical to the spill in the East Wing. She had seen it before but dismissed it as accidental. Now it made perfect sense. The caretaker had unknowingly carried information, leaving tiny markers that the criminal assumed would go unnoticed, but which revealed the pattern if observed carefully. The seemingly random details, the whispers, the misplaced objects, the innocuous comments, were all part of a map, one that led directly to the perpetrator. For the first time since the locket was stolen, Helena felt a surge of certainty. The key had been in plain sight all along, hiding behind ordinary habits and overlooked minutiae. The criminal had relied on their confidence that no one would notice the small, unremarkable traces, but Helena had noticed. The investigation was no longer merely reactive. The hidden pattern had revealed the path forward. She knew where to look next, and with it, she was certain she could confront the mastermind who had orchestrated every move in the shadows of Winthorpe Manor. Helena followed the trail through the manor with deliberate calm, her mind weaving together every fragment of evidence. The faint scratches on the panels, the subtle smears of ink, the misplaced button, even the overlooked hairpin, all converged toward one hidden chamber behind the East Wing's bookcase. She pressed against the panel, and it shifted under her fingers with a reluctant groan, revealing a narrow passage. Inside, the air was thick and still, carrying the faint metallic tang of something long concealed. At the far end of the passage, Lorne sat slumped against the wall, pale but alive, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and relief. A small desk nearby held the missing locket, placed beside stacks of old letters, journals, and ledgers. Every document Helena had suspected might connect the manor's past to the present. The realization hit her with sudden clarity. This was not a crime of greed, or mere ambition, or old grudges. The perpetrator's goal had never been the estate itself. It was control over a truth that had been buried for decades. Lorne looked up, the momentary composure he had maintained earlier crumbling as Helena approached. "You don't understand," he whispered. I had to make them see. They would have forgotten her again. They would have ignored the truth forever." She scanned the journals, recognizing names, dates, and patterns that traced back to Alara Harrington's disappearance. Lorne had meticulously recreated the past, placing clues, manipulating the witnesses, even orchestrating his own disappearance, to force the family and the authorities to confront what had been ignored for generations. His obsession was not wealth or revenge. It was the compulsion to uncover and expose a truth that he believed the world had deliberately overlooked. Helena realized then that the crime's extreme measures, the stolen locket, the threats, the carefully hidden passages, were born of psychological obsession. Lorne's mind had been consumed by the need to resurrect the past, to force acknowledgement of Ilara's absence, and to punish anyone who had failed to protect her memory. He had engineered terror not for material gain, but to impose a moral reckoning, a confrontation with guilt that no one had sought voluntarily. Looking at Lorne, Helena understood the depth of his fixation. The danger had never been in his physical strength or cunning alone. but in the intensity of his conviction, his willingness to manipulate, deceive, and frighten to achieve what he believed was justice. The shocking motive, hidden behind decades of loyalty and secrecy, revealed a darkness far more profound than she had anticipated. A mind driven by obsession where the boundaries between right and wrong had been utterly consumed by the need to reveal the truth. And in that moment, Helena knew the case was as much about restraining a mind as it was about solving a crime. The twisted secret of Winthorpe Manor was finally exposed, and the true battle lay in preventing that obsession from claiming anyone else. Helena closed the journals softly, their weight lingering in her hands like the final pieces of a puzzle at last aligned. Lorne watched her with a flicker of hope, misguided, dangerous hope, believing she might understand his crusade. But the truth now stood complete before her, and there was only one way forward. She stepped back toward the doorway, her voice steady and calm. "You've gone to extraordinary lengths, Lorne. Too many lives have been put at risk. It ends tonight." Her tone wasn't harsh, merely definitive. An anchor dropped into a sea of chaos. She had already positioned officers at the outer entrances and left a clear trail of footprints leading into the passageway, knowing Lorne's desperate instincts would drive him toward flight the moment he realized the illusion of control had slipped. The trap was set with the quiet precision of someone who understood both guilt and panic. For a heartbeat, Lorne seemed still, frozen between choice and inevitability. Then his gaze darted to the narrow exit behind the shelves, the same route he'd used to orchestrate his vanishing act. Exactly as she expected. He lunged, pushing past the desk, scattering papers like startled birds. Helena moved at once. But she didn't chase. She didn't have to. The hidden corridor led only one way, and she had sealed the other end minutes before entering. Lorne sprinted into the darkness, breath ragged, only to find the final door locked. His hands pounded against the wooden boards, wild and frantic, until her approaching footsteps stole the strength from his arms. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," he gasped, turning as she emerged into the narrow space. They were supposed to admit what they'd done. They were supposed to face it. "They will," Helena replied, her voice even, controlled. "But terror doesn't bring truth to light. Facts do, and I have every one of them." Lorne sagged against the wall, the last of his defiance buckling under the weight of reality. His eyes glistened, not with anger, but with the grief of someone who had crossed a line long before he realized there was no path back. "You don't understand," he whispered again, though the fight was gone from his words. "I just wanted justice." "And now," Helena said gently, stepping forward to secure his wrists, "justice will come. Properly this time." For a moment the passage fell silent except for the sharp click of the restraints. The tension that had simmered through the investigation rose to its last peak and finally broke, not with violence but with the quiet acceptance of truth revealed and choices exhausted. Helena guided him toward the light at the corridor's end, composed and steady, knowing she now held every thread of the case firmly in her grasp. The final move had been made, and the game was over. As Helena guided Lorne out of the narrow passage and into the lantern-lit hall, a hush settled over the Old Manor. Officers stepped forward to take him into custody, and for the first time since the night began, it felt as though the storm of deceit had finally settled. Lorne offered no resistance now, only a defeated hollow stare that clung to the walls, the floors, anywhere but her face. But as the officers led him away, Helena's gaze drifted toward the open ledger on the table, the one Lorne had been poring over before making his desperate dash. A page near the end lay folded back, as though marked in haste. She moved toward it instinctively, the prickling unease at the base of her spine returning with unwelcome familiarity. The case should have been over, and yet something tugged. She unfolded the page, a list of dates, transactions, names she recognized, Caldwell, Ingram, Hemsley, but also one that did not belong, glaringly out of place among the others, Mara Lindell. Helena froze. Mara Lindell had given testimony earlier in the investigation claiming she hardly knew anyone in the Manor Circle. She had insisted she'd come merely to deliver archived records requested weeks before the crime. Her account had been neat, unobtrusive, forgettable. exactly the sort of story meant to slip past notice. Helena's heartbeat steadied, yet sharpened. Lorne's motives had seemed painfully personal, rooted in family tragedy, but this was something else entirely. The signature beside Mara's name was recent, very recent. "Inspector?" one of the officers called, pausing with Lorne at the door. "We'll take him in now." Helena nodded, but her thoughts raced ahead of her. Lorne had acted alone in the attacks, yes, but he had not acted alone in the cover-up that started this nightmare. Someone had fed him information, someone who knew how to press on old wounds and point a desperate man toward destruction. As the hall emptied, a soft creak sounded from the upper landing. Helena's eyes flicked upward just in time to see Mara Lindell step back from the railing. Her expression tightened in a fleeting flicker of alarm before she vanished into the shadows of the corridor. Helena exhaled slowly through her nose. So it wasn't over, not yet. The true puppeteer was still inside the manor, and she had just revealed herself. Helena moved silently up the grand staircase, her boots echoing against the worn stone steps. The manor seemed almost alive around her, shadows stretching and twisting in the lantern light, as if sensing the final confrontation. Mara Lindell had vanished moments before, but Helena's instincts guided her to a small study at the rear of the east wing, a room lined with books and papers long thought forgotten. Inside, Mara waited, her posture composed yet tense, a faint smirk playing on her lips. "So, Inspector," she said, voice smooth, "you found the ledger. Impressive. But are you ready to understand the whole game?" Helena stepped closer, her eyes taking in every detail. The faint smudge of ink on Mara's cuff, the subtle dust patterns on the floor indicating recent movement, the slight tremor in her fingers betraying the calm exterior. "You've manipulated the investigation from the start," Helena said, her voice steady. "You knew Lorne's obsession, you planted evidence, you guided him toward the panic and the locket's theft, but you forgot one thing. Every subtle action leaves a trace, and I see them all." Mara's smirk faltered. "I was careful. I covered every path." "Almost," Helena replied. She gestured to the ledger. "You left Mara Lindell's name next to the most recent entries, the date, the instructions, the account of the missing documents. A moment of carelessness, perhaps? Or maybe a subconscious mark, revealing your hand." She walked slowly around the room, pointing out the evidence piece by piece. The smudged ink on the caretaker's lantern handled after Lorne's manipulations, the hairpin dislodged near the east wing desk, the scratches on the panel showing the secret passage Mara had used to move unseen, the subtle patterns of dust that betrayed Mara's careful navigation. Each clue, individually overlooked, together formed an undeniable map of Mara's orchestration. Mara swallowed hard. You followed everything," she whispered. "I did," Helena said, a calm certainty in her tone. "I followed the breadcrumbs, the psychological nudges, the faintest traces of human error. Lorne was your instrument, but you were the conductor. The motives, the obsession, the carefully timed chaos, they all lead back to you." Mara's eyes flickered to the window, considering flight. But Helena's calculated presence made hesitation deadly. "Justice will be served, Mara," Helena said softly. "Not through terror, but through the truth you tried to bury. Your orchestration ends tonight." With that, Helena signaled the officers, who stepped in to detain Mara without resistance. As the villain was escorted away, Helena lingered in the quiet of the study, tracing the path of the investigation one last time. She recounted the missed clues, the caretaker's subtle observations, the tiny smudges and scratches, the overlooked comments, the behavioral tics that betrayed both Lorne and Mara. Every thread that had seemed insignificant, every hesitation or misstatement, had been a deliberate mark of the criminal mind. But Helena had seen it, had read it, and had stayed one step ahead. Winthorpe Manor was silent now, but its twisted secrets lay exposed. Justice delivered not with chaos, but with the precise measure of insight only a detective of her caliber could provide. And though the case was resolved, Helena knew the manor's shadows would always remember the games played within its walls, a reminder that even the smallest details could never be ignored. Helena descended the staircase slowly. the manor now bathed in the soft glow of lanterns and the first hints of dawn filtering through the high windows. The halls were quiet, the lingering tension of the night settling into a fragile calm. Officers moved efficiently, cataloguing evidence, while the caretaker and other witnesses began to process the unraveling of decades-old secrets. Yet, as Helena passed the east wing doorway, her eyes caught a faint, almost imperceptible mark on the threshold, a delicate smudge of ink she didn't remember seeing before. It was tiny, easily dismissed, but something about its deliberate curve made her pause. She crouched to inspect it, tracing the pattern with her gloved finger, and felt that familiar prickle of curiosity. The mark didn't match Mara's handwriting, nor Lorne's, nor any of the known evidence. It was a different hand, one she hadn't accounted for. Helena stood slowly, her mind already racing. Perhaps it was nothing, a forgotten quirk of the manor, or perhaps it was a silent message meant to be discovered only by someone attentive enough to notice. She allowed herself a faint smile. The manor, it seemed, had more secrets tucked into its corners than even the most meticulous investigation could immediately reveal. Stepping into the morning air, the fog lifting to reveal the sprawling estate in pale light, Helena allowed herself a brief moment of satisfaction. Justice had been delivered, the twisted secrets of Winthorpe Manor laid bare, and the web of deception unraveled. Yet the faint smudge lingered in her mind like a whisper, a reminder that no mystery ever truly ends, that the shadows of the past could always cast themselves into the future, and that another puzzle might await where least expected. With measured steps, Helena turned from the manor, the weight of the case behind her, but the promise of the unknown ahead. The night had been solved, but the world remained full of secrets, and she would be ready. The game was never truly over, and the thrill of discovery awaited wherever the next mystery might unfold.